Hello, this video is about LD debate and how to flow. Now, flowing is important because it helps you keep track of the arguments that happen in the round. If you don't know your opponent's arguments, you can't respond and you'll probably lose the round. So watch this video as many times as you need to fully understand what flowing is and how to best do it. Now, first, I just want to review a couple quick things about what the structure of LD debate is. Now, obviously, there's two sides, one that affirms the resolution and one that negates. So the first speech, on both sides, they present their cases. So there's two separate cases happening in a round, and all debate is about one of these cases. So the first thing about flowing is that we separate the debate that is only about the affirmative case and the debate is only about the negative case. So the very first speech is the affirmative constructive, which is 6 minutes, and it's constructive because they're constructing their case. So in that 6 minutes, all the affirmative has to do is present their case. That's it. Then they sit down and there's cross-examination for 3 minutes when they defend their case against questions. So that is it. There is no debate against the negative here because they are only presenting their case. They have nothing to respond to because the negative has not presented their case yet. So then they sit down, the negative gets up and gives their negative constructive, in which they present their case. And that should only be about 4 minutes. And then they do not sit down. They then respond to the affirmative case. So this is responding on the affirmative side of the flow, all the debate on the affirmative. And they say that F case is bad because of X, Y, and Z. And then they sit down, and then there's a cross-examination in which the affirmative asks the negative for 3 minutes. Okay, following that is the first affirmative rebuttal, which is sometimes labeled the 1AR. So in this, the affirmative will likely begin by extending their case, the important points of their case, restating their case in a good way. And defending attacks that the negative made against their case. And they should save time because it is only 4 minutes. So they probably use 2 minutes to keep their case strong, keep it alive, and then they use the rest of their 2 minutes to attack the neg case. Wrong because of X, Y, and Z. Then the negative goes, and in their rebuttal, which is 6 minutes, they probably spend about half, 3 minutes, defending their case. Because this is their first chance to respond to what the affirmative said, so they'll probably spend a lot of time defending their case, restating important parts. And then give maybe a reason why their case should be used. So a voting issue for why to use their case. And then the negative will respond to the affirmative case. So they spend half their time defending their case, and then they spend half their time attacking affirmative case. And still wrong because of X, Y, Z. And you probably respond to what the affirmative responded to your first response. So if you said it's wrong because of X, the affirmative said, no, X is still what we should use because of this. You say their reason that you used X is wrong. So you're kind of flowing is the idea, that they presented their X, you say X is bad, they say no, use X, and then why X is still wrong. And then you sit down, the affirmative gives their final rebuttal, and in it they extend the only most important parts of their case because they only have 3 minutes to end the debate. So they'll spend a minute or two saying, "Judge, my case should be used because of these reasons." And defend, and that the negatives attacks weren't successful, basically. And then give a voting issue for why their case is good. And then they still have a minute left, so they should still definitively prove why Nate case is wrong. So you should give one voting issue at the very end, proving the affirmative case line, why it's right, and one why the negative case is bad. And similarly, at the end of the negative's last speech, they should provide one voting issue for why the affirmative is bad and why the negative is good, to make it simple for the judge. So this is the idea of flowing, where we have two separate flows. One on the top line, which is following the affirmative case, and all arguments for, about, and against the affirmative case. And the negative has a separate case, and we follow all arguments for and against it. So say that the affirmative is trying to prove that Oreos are the best cookie. Every argument about Oreos, against Oreos, anything about that only goes on the top line in the affirmative case. If the negative is talking about chocolate chip cookies, everything about chocolate chip cookies goes on the bottom line. Why chocolate chip cookies are bad, why, anything that is responding to the negative's arguments and negative's case, or anything the negative says about their own case goes in the negative line. This is very important to have two separate flows. Earlier part of this video, I went over the structure of debate, and on the affirmative case, they present their case, and there's 4 rebuttals after it. So overall, on the affirmative case flow, there are 5 places to write. On the negative, they don't do anything here because the affirmative isn't responding to the negative before they gave their case. So it only starts at where they present their case and the responses to that. So the negative only has 4 places to write. So when we make our flows before a case, we always start with 5 rows. And you want to label which one's the flow for the affirmative case, and which one's the flow for the negative case. So this is the aff case flow. You can label that to remember. And in this first column, what goes there? The affirmative constructive. Yikes. And I'm going to use abbreviations from now on. So after the affirmative constructive, the negative responds to the affirmative case. And then there's an affirmative rebuttal where they respond to what the negative said about their case, but it's still talking about their case. The negative responds, and then the affirmative gets the last word. So this is exactly what I wrote down here, that it's just this top part of the debate structure, following only the affirmative case. Similarly, the negative case has 4 flows, where the negative presents their case in the negative constructive, the affirmative responds to the negative case, the negative rebuts, and then there's the 2AR. So you want to label this at the beginning of your round. And a couple quick things, as you can see already I'm using abbreviations, and when you flow you want to use a lot of abbreviations. So already you can get ready to expect a value, because LD uses value, criterion, or standard. So you can get that ready. You can probably expect some definitions, and then there'll probably be a C1. There's definitely going to be a contention somewhere, so you can kind of get that ready to flow the aff case. And you can do the same thing on the negative. But you want to space it out because there's going to be probably a lot to say on these parts. Leave enough room for extra contentions too. Okay, so now we're going to watch the 2004 Lincoln Douglas debate national finals. Obviously the affirmative starts, so which flow do you go on? The affirmative flow. and we'll start by seeing what he has to say, and I'll flow the value and criterion and then stop.
I submit that if an individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him or her is unjust, and who willingly accepts the penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice, that individual is in reality expressing the highest respect for law. It's because I agree with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in his 1963 letter from a Birmingham jail. I affirm the resolution that civil disobedience in a democracy is morally justified. I have one definition. According to Professor Michael Walzer in his book Obligations, civil disobedience is a non-revolutionary encounter with the state, in which a person breaks the law but does so in ways which do not challenge the legitimacy of the legal or political system. This person feels morally bound to disobey, but also recognizes the moral value of the state. Civil disobedience is a way of maneuvering between these conflicting moralities. Disobedience willingly accepts punishment, which is a key distinguishing factor between disobedience and other forms of crime like vandalism, which are intended to remain anonymous. The highest value for this debate is morality, since the resolution questions whether civil disobedience can be justified on moral grounds. Democracies trust individuals to make moral decisions, so the criterion for morality is individual conscience. As political philosopher John Rawls writes in A Theory of Justice, even though people normally seek advice and counsel and accept the injunctions of those in authority when these seem reasonable to them, they are always accountable for their deed. We cannot divest ourselves of our responsibility and transfer the burden of blame to others. My first contention is that what is legal is not what is moral. Laws can and have been grossly immoral throughout history. Best illustrated.
Okay, so that is called the framework of the round. First, he defines civil disobedience, and when someone uses a source, you want to write the source. So it was Walzer, and note I'm using the abbreviation for civil disobedience. He defined it as a non-revolutionary encounter with the state, breaks the law, but doesn't challenge the overall legal system. And that it's a personal moral obligation to disobey, and that's usually what the intent of it is, and they intend to accept punishment as a result. So he's defining civil disobedience for the round, which is important because that's the topic. He states his value is morality. He states that his criterion is individual conscience, and he uses Rawls as a source, in which he says that we all have a personal responsibility to be moral. So already you can see that when you are debating that you only want to kind of write a few words about it, get the essential points that he's making. You don't have to write everything that they're saying because you'll definitely run out of space. Okay, so now we'll continue on to his contention, and I have to go back in the video a little bit to start there. And for this next part, remember with contentions that you need to identify who wrote the card, who the source is, what it's saying, and what the impact is for that card, so you can attack it as best as possible. So let's see what his contention 1 is.
Philosopher John Rawls writes in A Theory of Justice, even though people normally seek advice and counsel and accept the injunctions of those in authority when these seem reasonable to them, they are always accountable for their deed. We cannot divest ourselves of our responsibility and transfer the burden of blame to others. My first contention is that what is legal is not what is moral. Laws can and have been grossly immoral throughout history, best illustrated with the help of the 1927 Supreme Court decision, Buck v. Bell. The state of Virginia was attempting to forcibly sterilize Mrs. Carrie Bell, an institutionalized inmate in a state facility. Mrs. Bell sued to prevent the operation. On an 8-1 decision, the court struck down the legal challenge. The majority opinion read, quote, "The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting the fallopian tubes. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough." Denying the legitimacy of civil disobedience would mean not only that Mrs. Bell would be unjustified in attempting to resist this most inhumane of procedures, but that a doctor ought simply perform his duty and would in fact be remiss if he objected on principle. John Rawls, previously cited, agrees that in a democracy, law is not the ultimate moral arbiter. If the sovereign is held to govern by divine right as God's chosen lieutenant, then his subjects have only the rights of suppliants. They can plead their cause, but they cannot disobey should their appeal be denied. To do this would be to rebel against the final legitimate moral and not simply legal authority. But once society is interpreted as a scheme of cooperation among equals, those injured by serious injustices need not submit. By resisting injustice within the limits of fidelity to law, civil disobedience serves to inhibit departures from justice and correct them when they do occur. My second contention is that civil disobedience functions as a reciprocal check against society. I argue there are two truths fundamental to a democratic conception of the individual moral agent. The first truth is that citizens can't use the law to shirk their own moral responsibility. Throughout history, the claim, "I was just following orders," has been used to justify a wide variety of atrocities. But citizens can't ignore their conscience simply because the law says otherwise. The second truth is that law cannot be used to force individuals to suffer under oppression. Democratic respect for the individual entails a corresponding individual claim to resist outside domination. Civil disobedience functions to amplify the ideas of minorities, allowing them to enter into the democratic sphere as legislation or court decisions or be discarded. Jonathan Wolfe writes in his book, An Introduction to Political Philosophy, "Treating conscientious disobedience as treason in order to preserve social unity is surely a mistake. The dissenting citizen has a place. He or she should not be silenced for the sake of peace. Perhaps the majority is wrong. But even if the majority is right, attention still should be paid to dissenters. By way of analogy, even though an individual can use their right to free speech to distribute racist propaganda, this doesn't mean that free speech itself is immoral." Disobedience by unions like the IWW led to the introduction of the 40-hour work week and other workers' benefits. Women's suffrage groups also used the tactic to gain the vote. Yet just as civil disobedience is a check upon society, society checks civil disobedience. When Alabama Governor George Wallace tried to block implementation of desegregation laws, the National Guard was called in to fix the problem. Notice that all of these examples used the democratic process to try and effect change. None of them rejected the majoritarian system of lawmaking in any way. Individuals accepted punishment to publicize their message, which was then considered democratically and either accepted or rejected. Notice also that even though the intent of civil disobedience may be to cause change, the fact that it fails in some instances doesn't make it unjustified. A politician who runs for office and loses is not wrong for doing so, perhaps just unfortunately uncharismatic. Finally, it should be noted that civil disobedience can be a tremendously attractive option should the courts be unresponsive or the egregiousness of the problem especially demanding. At other times, it can be just one among many avenues, like the civil rights period, when disobedience, legal challenges, and grassroots efforts worked in tandem. And to be sure, civil disobedience is often difficult, or the threat of punishment may discourage its use. But it's the affirmative argument that the decision to use civil disobedience should be the individual's alone. If the individual wishes to accept the punishment and the risks that go with it in order to assuage his or her conscience, he or she is entirely morally justified.
Okay, so that was the affirmative case constructive. Make this a little smaller so it all fits on one sheet. Okay, so he presented his value of morality, his criterion, definitions, contention 1, used a card. I missed something here, so if you ever miss something when you're flowing, you're just too busy writing stuff ahead, try to move on as quick as you can, but sometimes you're not quick enough, so make sure you write a question mark so you can ask during cross-ex, what did you say after the buck card in contention 1? So that's why you write these signposts to tell you where to look on your flow and where to ask questions. So now, you remember I put a question mark in the affirmative case, so the cross-ex happened and I asked, what was your card after buck and forcible sterilization in your contention 1? And he said it was Rawls, and he reread his card for me. So always feel free to use cross-ex in order to make sure that you have your flow correct, because if your flow is not correct, you're going to miss some arguments, and you can easily lose a debate. If you're a novice, your main focus for your first year is making sure you can answer every argument. So, so I got that, double-checked my flow, asked some good questions during cross-ex. Generally, cross-ex doesn't go on the flow, but if there's an important concession, it's important that you bring it up in the negative so that the judge can put it on their flow and remember. And some judges do take cross-ex flow, but generally, as a debater, it's not that important. Just ask important questions, ask for clarifications. So now the negative is going to give their first constructive case. So this is a completely new case. So which flow does it go on? It goes on the negative flow, where the negative constructive is. So everything that he presents now is going into the negative constructive flow. So get that piece of paper ready.
With that, now let's turn to the negative. While the affirmative may make civil disobedience sound like a wonderful way to promote change, he never explains why change means one person should have more power than everyone else. Because civil disobedience fails to respect other people's rights to have a say in democracy, I negate. The resolution asks whether civil disobedience is justified, so the value ought to be justice, defined as giving each his or her due. Specifically, justice in a democracy means giving each citizen his or her due in terms of political power and expression. Henry Mayo clarifies how democracy does this in an introduction to democratic theory. Democracy is unique in recognizing the political expression of conflicting interests and opinions as legitimate. Democracy provides for the peaceful adjustment of disputes, the maintenance of order, and the working out of public policies by means of its compromise function. The benefit of this compromise is that all interests and opinions are expressed and weighed fairly when no one can agree, rather than one person's interest dominating the rest. Therefore, the criterion for justice is fair consideration of interests. Ethicist Peter Singer writes, "The decision procedure in which all members have equal say in decisions and then accept the result is a paradigm of fair consideration. It is beneficial since a peaceful settlement of disputes is better than settlement by force, and it is just because it evaluates each interest fairly." My contention is that civil disobedience denies fair consideration of interests by asserting the power of one person over the rest of society and legitimizing the use of coercion to resolve disagreements. Civil disobedience, editor Dwight Murphy notes, is exquisitely embroidered with love and goodwill, but stripped to its essentials, it is the concept that every man can be his own judge and jury and legislator, that a minority has the right to flout the law, to force its will upon society. Breaking the law, unlike free speech or legal protests, unjustly limits the rights of others by undermining the role they had in making that law in the first place. There's no point to voting for the stance you want if someone can just override your vote at any time by refusing to obey the authority of the vote's result. Singer explains, in claiming that his own judgment entitles him to a greater say in the matter than the others, the dissenter is making a claim which the others could make, and which, if many of them did make, would be incompatible with a peaceful decision procedure. Due to the impossibility of reaching agreement, it would be best if everyone accepted compromise instead of acting on their own individual judgments. A society in which everyone acted on individual judgments would legitimize use of coercion to solve disagreements. Civil disobedience upsets legal avenues for social change, like public forums, where disagreements can coexist. Instead, it turns disagreement into conflict. When your spoken argument is made useless by the direct action of others, the only way to defend your beliefs is with retaliatory action. For example, if a racist restaurant owner decides to civilly disobey an equal rights protection law by kicking a black man out of his shop, the only way that man can get to eat inside the restaurant is if he forces his way in. Far from giving the minority a check against the majority, civil disobedience overrides checks that already exist in the law, turning disagreement into a battle of might is right, where the strongest group wins. Supreme Court Justice Charles Whittaker writes, minority groups, in preaching and practicing defiance of the law, are in fact advocating erosion and destruction of the only structure that can permanently maintain due process and the equal protection of the laws, and thereby protect them from discriminations and abuses. The key reason why democracy works is that people can express their beliefs in legal ways, such as public forums, voting, or legal protests, but refrain from acting on those beliefs in favor of peace and fairness. Civil disobedience destroys both, and that's why we negate. Now let's turn to the affirmative side.
Okay, so he presented his case, and remember, he didn't just present his case and sit down. He's going to attack the affirmative case now. So just fixing my spelling because my spelling is bad, but just putting something is better than nothing, like I said. So we have his value of justice. We have one little reason why we should use justice, the criterion of fair consideration, and why Singer says we should use that criterion. Contention 1, CD asserts one group over another. We have a Murphy card. You can label your cards a little better so you kind of understand the points that the card is making. I missed a card, so during cross-ex I'll have to make sure I ask that. And as he said, now moving on to the affirmative. So that means moving on to the affirmative case as responses to that. So you want to get your affirmative case ready. So I'll restart at the beginning so you can get prepared to write on the affirmative case flow.
Works is that people can express their beliefs in legal ways, such as public forums, voting, or legal protests, but refrain from acting on those beliefs in favor of peace and fairness. Civil disobedience destroys both, and that's why we negate. Now let's turn to the affirmative side. He gives you this value of morality and the valid criterion of individual conscience. Put them together because basically he defines morality as what the individual likes. However, while it's easy for my opponent to justify disobedience by looking at the problem through the eyes of one person at a time, it would be easy for it to be moral because then I would do whatever I think is right. However, the resolution is about individuals in the context of a democracy, which is a society containing multiple people. Therefore, the only way to universally justify the resolution as a general principle is by affirming for all people at the same time collectively. In other words, disobedience must be justified for everyone in a democracy. Now, if everyone has absolute moral authority and absolute individual conscience as he claims, then rights will always conflict and then none will matter. But law limits absolute rights so everyone can enjoy them at least partially. Because multiple people have equal rights, the only way to maximize them for an entire society at once is to have obligations that consider others as well as yourself. He basically admits this in cross-examination, where he tells you that even if your individual conscience tells you to harm other people, you can't do that, because you have to consider your moral obligations to other people before you consider your moral obligations to do whatever you think is right. At that point, you can't look towards this absolute value of morality with the criterion of individual conscience, because everyone has their own conception of morality. That's why you look towards the value of justice, to make sure that everyone has their due in expressing their own moral beliefs and their own individual conscience. And you look towards the criterion of fair consideration of interest, because that criterion prioritizes your moral obligations to other people over your moral obligations to follow your own conscience. Go to his contention 1 now. He talks about how laws can be immoral. However, the individual can be immoral as well. He still hasn't proven any sort of definite benefit to the affirmative side in terms of morality. The problem is he talks about all these inhumane procedures, but the problem is that the law could just as well be protecting rights. I gave you the example of the Equal Rights Protection Law and make sure that whites and blacks can eat together in a restaurant. But people can civilly disobey that on an individual level because racists might think that it's right to be racist. At that point, he can't even achieve morality because there's this problem of basically people can be wackos. Okay, turn to his contention 2 now. He talks about how democracy looks towards the individual moral agent, and we always have our own individual responsibility to change laws. However, remember we can't change laws however we like. He admits in cross-examination that we have moral obligations to others that take precedence over how we would like to change laws. At that point, you can't change laws by doing whatever you like and enacting change by breaking laws. You have to work within the democratic procedure because it makes sure everyone has some sort of fair and equal say. Then he says we can't be forced to suffer under oppression, but remember, I told you that laws can prevent oppression, like that Equal Rights Protection Law. Okay, then he talks about how just because we have the right to free speech and people can use it for racist propaganda, doesn't mean that the right to free speech is bad. At that point, he's looking towards the moral justification of the act of civil disobedience itself. But that means that if we're only looking at the act, then he can't derive any benefits from expressing individual conscience, because we're no longer looking at the motives of individual conscience behind the act, we're only looking at the act itself. Finally, he talks about how if we accept punishment, it's all okay. However, a study from the University of North Carolina shows that even homicide committers accept punishment, but obviously they're still not morally justified in what they do.
Sorry, what was the last thing you said? I just didn't hear it.
I basically said that even if people accept punishment, that doesn't mean the act they committed or they accept punishment for is necessarily morally justified.
Okay, so the criterion then is fair consideration of interest,
Sure.
right? And you say that we can't settle problems by force.
Right.
Okay, so if civil disobedience isn't forceful, and if I say anyone can be civilly disobedient, have I...
Okay, so there right at the beginning you saw that even in the national debate, the affirmative made sure to check that they got the last thing that the opponent said right, and to make their flow clear. So flowing used at all levels of debate is something that you'll always need to know, so you need to make sure you got that straight. Yeah, so you can kind of see why it's called a flow, because we're flowing, it's across the flow. We're seeing how each argument is argued back and forth by each side. So against the value criterion, he responds through that morality and individual conscience are up to each person, and we don't need to care about that. What we should care about is democracy, because that's what the resolution states. Rights will always conflict. So he kind of is going against the whole value criterion. He didn't offer any definition, so there isn't any debate here. So you could, if that happens, this is really what it should look like. You could put like def x, no response. Or you can circle it to show that the opponent didn't respond. You can bring that up. If this is central to his argument that they're accepting punishment, that all these things are vital to his case, he needs to restate that that's the definition they're using. And because the opponent didn't offer another definition, this is the definition we use for the debate. But the negative didn't think that was important, so he didn't respond. He responds to contention 1, that individuals can be immoral, so how is that different from immoral laws, basically? He uses his example of a racist, that if a racist doesn't like the law, should he not obey it because he finds it personally to be immoral? In contention 2, he says, responds to contention 2, he says, and he knows how he signposts. He says that, look at contention 1, I respond this. Look at contention 2, my opponent said this, well, I think this. And then at the end, he responds to, and you kind of see how it all matches up, that everything is responding to the thing before it. Okay, so that is the negatives constructed right there. Now we're going to watch the 1AR. I skipped the cross-ex. I gave you a little sample of that to see that you can ask clarifying questions, skipping the prep time. Now the affirmative will speak, so we're not sure which side of the flow he'll begin on, whether he'll start by defending his own affirmative case or attacking the negative. So we'll have to see if he signposts what to do. And usually you can signpost with the judge by saying, I'll give a roadmap, as it's called, and start on the negative side of the flow, which is the negative case, or the affirmative side of the flow. He doesn't do that, but you can tell by how he's talking that he's responding to what the negative says. So he starts on the negative side of the flow, so get that sheet ready. And then he will move to the affirmative side, because you have to do both flows during all your rebuttals.
In his last speech, the negative tells you that we need to have fair consideration of the interests of individuals. And then in cross-examination, although it was a little bit hard to hear, we set up 4 planks that I need to meet in order to meet his standard. So the first is that it's non-violent. Remember, that's fine. I tell you, civil disobedience doesn't encompass violence because it's a non-revolutionary encounter with the state. And since the state is the organism in society that has a monopoly on legitimate violence, civil disobedience precludes any sort of violent action. That's the first plank. The second plank is that it's universal, that everyone should be able to do it. That's fine. I grant that some people might use civil disobedience in ways we don't like. The governor of Alabama might try and stop blacks from entering schools after desegregation orders have been filed. I'll grant that. My argument, though, is that society has reciprocal checks to prevent that, so the National Guard gets sent in and actually allows those students to go forth. So it's universal, second plank. The third argument is that I still respect authority. Remember, civil disobedience takes place still recognizing the legitimate authority of the state. A civil disobedient is punished. The reason we have laws to say if you break such and such a statute, you will be hit with such and such a penalty. The person who does that through civil disobedience accepts the ability of the law to punish, i.e. they accept the authority of the majority to pass whatever laws they want. Civil disobedience is just another avenue for the minority to amplify their voices and get them into society. So the fourth argument, and the fourth plank that I meet, is that we're still using democratic processes. Remember, civil disobedience still go through the courts. They still try and persuade the majority. At that point, you're still respecting everyone. So look to his criterion of fair consideration of interests. Fine, it's completely fair. The individual who commits civil disobedience isn't saying that they're any better than anyone else or that the law ought not apply to them. They're just saying that they choose to accept the consequences of breaking a law. Look to the first contention then, where he says that civil disobedience asserts the power of one member over society. Remember, that's completely untrue. Civil disobedience is just one part of an integral mechanism between society and the individual. It doesn't say the individual is better than society or outside society's laws. It says that the individual will, for a moral reason, choose to break the law and accept punishment. Then he gives you a Singer card saying that everyone should compromise because if everyone was disobedient, there would be chaos. Well, remember, if everyone filed a civil suit in court, then the courts would be clogged and shut down. And if everyone wanted to hold an assembly under their rights guaranteed in the First Amendment, then no one would be available to go to assemblies, and no one would go. So the fact that if everyone would do something, it would destroy the process, isn't a reason to reject civil disobedience any more than it is a reason to reject civil suits. The next argument he gives you is that racists might kick blacks out of a restaurant and they have to force their way back in. Remember, that's completely untrue. The federal government would probably go in and stop those people from stopping legitimate customers from entering an establishment. So look to the affirmative side of the flow. His argument is that we look to the conscience of democracy and you have to respect all people. You have obligations to consider others. Completely fine. I admit that in the definition of what civil disobedience means. Then he tells you the individual can be immoral. My argument is the state can be immoral too. So we should allow the individual moral conscience to act as a check upon society within the limits I prescribe in my definition. His next argument is, again, he repeats the racist argument. Remember, my argument is it's a reciprocal check law fixes. What Rawls then tells you is that in a democracy, the sovereign isn't the final moral authority. This is pretty important. It says that the law doesn't have inherent moral value, so there's no moral obligation to obey it. The second contention then says that civil disobedience is a check. He tells you laws can stop oppression. I say civil disobedience is another avenue. He says we have to work within the system. That's fine. I'm still accepting the system. Remember, civil disobedience uses the democratic process as a way to effect great change. And then he tells you that we're not looking at motives. That's fine. I'm saying it's always a good thing to be faithful to your own moral conscience within limits. So as long as an individual has fidelity to their own moral compass, that's a moral thing regardless of the motive.
So there you can see that the affirmative started on the negative, responding to neg, and they said now on the affirmative flow, kind of accepts this, argues against what the neg says here, against his case, to defend his case, and then also doesn't respond to the negative's point that accepting punishment doesn't mean it's moral in its own way. So maybe he doesn't think it's an important point, maybe he ran out of time, so those are things to think about. After some prep time, it's the negative's turn to speak. So we'll see if he signposts where to start. We're not sure yet. Yep. Staying hydrated is important for debate as well.
Let's start with the value and the value criterion. Basically, he doesn't answer the argument where I told you that morality is subjective, which he agrees to in cross-examination. He says that all individuals have different moral beliefs. At that point, everyone has all this moral agency, but the resolution is asking us to morally justify civil disobedience in the context of a democracy where multiple people exist. At that point, if everyone has this equal right to express their moral individual conscience, as he's saying, we can't have this absolute right because it's going to conflict all the time. Therefore, we have to accept restrictions on how we can express our moral beliefs, or else we have clash all the time. Essentially, if we want to guarantee some sort of fairness and equality in moral expression of individual conscience for everybody, we have to find some sort of compromise. That's why we look towards the value of justice, giving each their due in terms of moral agency and expression of their moral beliefs, and the value criterion of fair consideration of interest, so we can make sure that everyone gets a fair and equal say in this. He gives 4 reasons why he does fulfill the fair consideration of interest. The first is that he says it's non-violent, so therefore you're not harming anyone. However, this contradicts his case position, because his case position says to do whatever your conscience tells you. I told you at the end of the last speech that some homicide committers think that their conscience tells them to harm others. At that point, he agrees that the moral obligations you have towards others take precedence over doing what you like. But then he says, we disagree on what these moral obligations are. At that point, the only way you can determine some sort of moral obligation rule for society is to make sure that everyone has a fair say in what moral obligations to other people are. That's what happens in democracy. Everyone votes on what's the ground basis for how you can treat other people. You can still express your beliefs through legal channels, but you can't express them however you like. You still have to follow some basic moral obligations in how you treat others. That's the point of democratic law. It gives you this ground basis, these moral obligations on how you have to treat other people. No one agrees on what those moral obligations are. Therefore, we vote and we come to some sort of compromise so that everyone has equal moral agency. But then, if he admits that moral obligations to others take precedence over doing what you like, at this point, he already says disobedience is unjustified, because it's asserting your moral agency over other people's rights and your moral obligations to other people. That's the first voting issue of the negative side, that in order to have this fair consideration of interest, moral obligations to others take precedence over your own right to do whatever you think is right. Okay. Now let's go to the second reason why he says he fulfills fair consideration of interest. He says, well, he just has to prove it's universal. And he says society has reciprocal checks. And basically he says, well, you accept punishment. That's his third voting issue, third reason why as well. But basically, I told you in the last speech that just because you accept punishment doesn't mean your act was morally justified. I gave you the example of homicide committers who think they're morally justified in killing other people. If he says, well, this is a violent example, I mean, I can give you other examples like thieves who think stuff really belongs to them, so they just go and steal it. And that's not really violent, but it's still harming other people. At this point, even if you accept punishment for your act, it's not going to be morally justified. So all this stuff about accepting punishment, which he really seems to rely on throughout his case, doesn't make civil disobedience morally justified. That's the second voting issue of the negative side. Okay. Then his fourth reason why he fulfills fair consideration of interest is because basically we're still having this legitimate democratic process. He says it's one part of the balance between society and the individual. But I already told you in my first voting issue as a negative that your moral obligations are defined by law because that's where everyone gets an equal say to say what these moral obligations are. And these moral obligations take precedence over doing what you think is right. So it's not really part of the balance between society and the individual. It's the individual imposing their moral beliefs on everyone else. So then you look to my first contention, where I told you about basically is looking towards asserting your power of one individual over the rest of society. He says, well, it's just part of the balance, and the federal government is going to come in. But basically, what happens is, by saying you obey some sort of higher moral law than the one that everyone else has agreed on, you're saying that your moral beliefs matter more than everyone else. At this point, there's no fair consideration of interest because you're not considering other people's moral beliefs. You're only considering your moral beliefs. So he's not achieving morality or justice on any level. That's going to be the third voting issue of the negative. But the fourth voting issue of the negative is going to come from the very bottom of the negative case, where I told you if the minority is justified in breaking the law, the majority is going to justify disobedience right back. That's going to cancel all the institutional checks that already exist in the law and turn conflict resolution into a battle of might is right. He says the federal government is going to come in, but that's a factual statement. We're looking at moral justifications here. And if he morally justifies it for the minority to disobey in order to defend themselves, then he also has to morally justify it for the majority to come right back and repress the minority even more. I give you an example, like say the black people decide to more simply disobey a law. Basically, they want their equal rights. Then the white people are going to come right back and simply disobey an equal rights protection law or a due process law to oppress the minority even more. At that point, there's no solving problems at all. Then go back to the affirmative case, where he talks about how the state can be immoral too and individual morality is a check. But the state is the synthesis of individual moralities. It allows everyone an equal chance to express their moral individual beliefs. That's why there's a fair consideration of interest on the negative side and none on the affirmative. Finally, he says the sovereign isn't the final moral authority, and we have to be faithful to our own conscience, but he already agreed that moral obligations to others take precedence over following your own conscience. And since the state is the expression of those moral considerations to other people, you have to follow them. For these reasons, you vote negative in today's round.
Okay, so there you could see that the negative response, the affirmative case, mostly the framework, because the framework is key for debate. I couldn't really flow it that evenly here, so I'm sorry about that, but make sure you leave a lot of room for the framework. I tried to label it so you know which responses are going to which, so they're not right by each other, but you would draw an arrow to show that. I wish I could in Office, but I can't. And then also how contention 1 is being responded to here, and how his bottom response to minority groups could erode civil disobedience. This is kind of key to his point. And then his responses on the AF case, once he talks about the AF case, where he puts them. And overall, he started about the value framework debate. So he didn't really start in one case or the other, and some people do that. So be ready to kind of listen to what they're saying and figure out where in the flow to put it. So here he's saying that he didn't really, the negative didn't respond to this that well. And talks about his moral subjectivity point against the value criterion. Here he talks about the same thing as defending his moral subjectivity point. So kind of the debate seems to be on the neg side for the framework. Now is the final speech where the affirmative gives their last rebuttal for 3 minutes. They'll address both cases and we'll kind of see how he does that.
I realized that there were more than 2 voting issues given in the negative rebuttal, but I think that all of his arguments basically boil down to 2 arguments. The first is that we can't do whatever we want because we have some sort of obligation to other people. Granted, I tell you, civil disobedience means respecting that obligation and respecting the inherent individual worth of other people. That's why it's nonviolent. That's why it's a way of maneuvering between the conflicting moralities of the state and the individual. At that point, I'm saying there are limits on civil disobedience, but as long as you don't harm other people, it's still justified. Remember, the law exists to punish people who violate it, and people who violate laws through civil disobedience are punished. So at that point, you are not saying that you can do whatever you want to other people. You're just saying that if you choose to accept individual punishment and not hurt anyone else, it's entirely your decision. The next argument he gives you is that we shouldn't impose our beliefs on other people or say that they're more important. Remember what I tell you, that doesn't happen either. Civil disobedience is universally justified no matter what your belief is, just as I am universally justified in using my right to free speech to talk about whatever I want as long as it doesn't incite violence. So what that means then is that even if we disagree with other people, it's not saying that our rights are more, or our morals are more important than theirs. It's saying that we choose to use this avenue as a way to promote discussion. Remember that I'm telling you, we use the democratic process when you're civilly disobedient. That as soon as you disobey a law, it enters into the courts or you try and generate public opinion to pass new legislation. So you're still respecting society's beliefs. My argument is that since morality differs from individual to individual, as long as the individual stays within the prescribed limits I give you and respects the individual agency of other actors by not using violence, by not destroying property, by accepting the punishment laid down by the majority, it's entirely good that they follow their own moral conscience. Remember, they might go to jail or they might be fined, but if they believe they're doing the moral thing, that's fine, and it's not our decision to make to tell them they ought not do it. Additionally, remember what John Rawls tells you, that in a democracy, the sovereign isn't the final moral authority as would exist in an authoritarian government or a monarchy. So that means there's no moral obligation to obey the law, which isn't moral in any instance. He tells you that the law can be immoral, but I'm saying that because there's no fundamental moral quality to the law, there doesn't exist a moral obligation. Then the only other argument he's really got going for him is that the majority then can oppress the minority. But my argument is that civil disobedience is only one of several different checks in society, and that if the majority tries to oppress the minority, like the governor of Alabama did, then the societal legal system will step in and stop him from doing that. So at that point, there is no violence, there's no infringement of other people's rights. All I'm allowing people to do is remain faithful to their own moral conscience. That's always morally justified, as long as you don't cause harm to other people. So that's the reason then that you affirm the resolution.
So there you have the debate. That's how a flow should work. Quick thing, if you look at how things flow across, like in contention 2, that he's talking about, it's CD is a reciprocal check on society. Citizens can't use the law to avoid individual responsibility. The law can't force us to suffer oppression. The negative says that we need to make sure that all are taken into account. We need to work within democracy, and laws themselves prevent oppression. So if someone individually believes that being racist is good, we have to make sure we have laws that prevent oppression. He says that the sovereign isn't the final moral authority. He brings up Rawls again. That individual authority of the individual is. Like Martin Luther King says that the individual has the moral, he was morally right and that segregation is bad. And in this case, he was probably right. So he kind of brings that up. And the negative responds by saying that overall we have a moral obligation to others, and the state takes that into account. So we have to follow the state because it finds some type of moral common ground. So that's what we should follow. If Martin Luther King didn't believe the law to be moral, working within legal systems allows his voice to be heard and the morality of the state to change. And we can agree on a new morality that segregation is bad. The affirmative says that civil dispute kind of continues on. We're bringing up the point that the state is not the final moral arbiter, the individual is. So if it boils down to the individual's moral ideas should be used, then he kind of wins the debate. But if you believe that the sovereign or the state should be the one to kind of take control of deciding morality, then you think the neg wins. So that's kind of how flowing works. Make sure that everything flows across the flow. Draw arrows if things aren't really that clear so you know how the debate progressed. And always save your flow so you can look at how the debate happened, what ended up being kind of the voting issues, the main points that each side was trying to make. And as you can see, things are dropped sometimes. And the neg didn't think it was essential to their case to prove their definition wrong, so the definition wasn't debated and it was dropped quickly. But as a debater, you kind of want to, early on, as a novice, get used to making arguments against everything and anything you can. So that's flowing. I'll watch this video again and again. Make sure you understand it. Flow the video that the 2001 Lincoln Douglas Debate National Finals to practice. Make sure you're using 2 separate flows for each case. And just practice a lot. The only way you get better at flowing is by doing it a lot. So, yeah, good luck with the debate.